There are different kinds of silence. The silence of a church on Sunday morning, heavy with expectation. The silence of a forest at dawn, alive with hidden movement. The silence of a man holding his breath in darkness, listening to voices that should not exist where he stands. In Georgia, 1857, there was a plantation where silence had become something else entirely. A living thing that wrapped itself around the throat of anyone who dared speak the truth. The white columns of Riverside Manor stood 3 stories high, casting shadows that stretched across cotton fields where 200 souls labored under the merciless sun. But it was not in those fields where the most terrible secrets lived. It was in the walls. This is not a story about ghosts or spirits. This is a story about what happens when a man learns things he was never meant to know, and how the very architecture of a house can become a confession chamber for sins that would shake an entire county to its foundations. This is a story about how sound travels through hollow spaces, and how some silences are more dangerous than any scream. What you are about to hear has been pieced together from courthouse records, letters found in an attic trunk in 1903, and the sworn testimony of 3 people who were there. The truth of what happened at Riverside Manor was buried for good reason. Perhaps it should have stayed buried, but some stories refuse to remain silent. Samuel was 32 years old the first time he heard the voices in the walls. He had been born on Riverside Manor, as had his mother before him, and he carried the particular kind of quietness that comes from learning early that invisibility is survival. He was not remarkable to look at, average height, lean from work, with hands scarred from years of carpentry. Master Garrett had recognized his skill with wood when Samuel was barely 14, and since then he had maintained the big house, repairing banisters, fixing loose floorboards, replacing rotted window frames. This was considered good fortune among the enslaved population of Riverside. Housework meant being spared the brutal labor of the fields. It meant better food, cleaner clothes, and most importantly, it meant being unremarkable enough that the white family barely noticed your presence. Samuel had perfected the art of being unremarkable. It was late March when everything changed. The afternoon sun slanted through the windows of the second-floor hallway, illuminating dust motes that drifted like tiny ghosts. Samuel knelt beside the baseboard in the guest bedroom, investigating a section that had begun to pull away from the wall. The Garretts were hosting a dinner party that evening for neighboring plantation owners, and Mistress Garrett had been very clear that everything must be perfect. Samuel wedged his pry bar behind the baseboard and gently pulled. The wood came away easily, too easily. Behind it, instead of the solid brick he expected, there was darkness. A hollow space, perhaps 6 inches deep, running along the base of the wall. He had worked on this house for 18 years and never known this cavity existed. Samuel leaned closer, peering into the gap. The hollow appeared to extend in both directions along the wall, and when he turned his head, pressing his ear near the opening, he heard something that made his breath catch. Voices. Not the muffled, indistinct sounds of people in nearby rooms, but clear words, as if the speakers were standing right beside him. Yet the guest bedroom was empty, and had been all morning. "Can't keep this up much longer," a man was saying. Samuel recognized the voice. Master Garrett himself. "You don't have a choice." This second voice was unfamiliar, rough, with an accent Samuel couldn't place. "The debt is what it is. You pay, or everyone learns how you really acquired this land." Samuel's heart began to pound. He should replace the baseboard and leave immediately. He should forget what he had heard. But his ear remained pressed to that dark gap in the wall, because what came next froze him in place. "The shipment arrives next Tuesday," Master Garrett said, and his voice carried a tone Samuel had never heard before, something close to fear. "After that, we'll have enough to satisfy Charleston. But if anyone discovers what we've been—" "No one will discover anything," the rough voice interrupted, "not unless you're foolish enough to write more of those letters." Footsteps, growing fainter. A door closing. Samuel sat back on his heels, his mind racing. He should not have heard that conversation. Master Garrett's study was on the opposite end of the house, separated from this room by the main staircase and at least 40 feet of solid construction. Yet the voices had been perfectly clear, as if channeled through the walls themselves by some trick of architecture. He replaced the baseboard carefully, his hands shaking slightly as he tapped the small nails back into place. When he finished, there was no evidence that anything had been disturbed. But Samuel could not stop thinking about what he had heard. The debt is what it is. Everyone learns how you really acquired this land. The shipment arrives next Tuesday. That evening, as Samuel carried firewood through the back corridors of the big house, he found himself studying the walls with new attention. Riverside Manor had been built in 1791 by Master Garrett's grandfather, back when this part of Georgia was still considered frontier territory. The house had been expanded twice, once in 1803 and again in 1829, creating a sprawling structure with odd angles and unexpected spaces. Samuel had always attributed the house's peculiar layout to these additions, but now he wondered if there was more to it. The dinner party that night was loud and long. Samuel stayed in the kitchen quarters, helping to prepare and serve the endless courses that Mistress Garrett demanded. But his mind was elsewhere, turning over the puzzle of those voices in the wall. Samuel began his investigation the next morning, though he could not have explained, even to himself, exactly what he was investigating. He simply knew that something was wrong at Riverside Manor, something that had been hidden in plain sight for years, perhaps decades. His work gave him access to every part of the house, and he used this freedom carefully. He moved through rooms with his tools, ostensibly checking for loose boards or damaged plaster, but actually examining the walls themselves. He tapped gently on panels, listening for the hollow sound that would indicate empty space behind. He studied the angles where walls met, looking for inconsistencies in the construction. What he discovered was remarkable. The house was full of hollow passages. Not large spaces, most were narrow gaps between the interior and exterior walls, perhaps 6 to 8 inches wide. But they formed a network that ran throughout the entire structure, connecting rooms that seemed distant from each other. And more importantly, these passages appeared to have been designed intentionally. At certain points, the gaps widened into small chambers, each one positioned precisely beneath floor vents or beside chimney stacks. Samuel realized he was looking at an acoustic system, a deliberate arrangement that allowed sound to travel through the house in unexpected ways. Someone had built Riverside Manor to carry conversations from one room to another, creating channels where words could flow like water through hidden pipes. But why? The answer came on a Thursday afternoon when Samuel was repairing a cracked window frame in Master Garrett's private study. The master was away in Savannah on business, and Samuel worked alone, carefully removing the damaged wood. As he pulled the frame free, he saw another hollow space behind it, larger this time, perhaps 18 inches deep. And inside this space, resting on a small wooden shelf, were papers. Samuel should not have looked. Every instinct cultivated over 32 years of enslavement told him to leave those papers untouched, to replace the window frame and forget he had seen anything. But his hands moved almost without conscious thought, reaching into that dark space and withdrawing a leather folder tied with string. Inside were letters. The first was dated October 1838, written in elegant handwriting. Your discretion in this matter has been invaluable. The cargo from Charleston arrived safely, and no one in the county suspects our arrangement. The profit from this venture will clear your debt to the Carolina Consortium within 3 years, provided you maintain absolute silence regarding the true nature of these shipments. Samuel read carefully, his comprehension growing with each page. The letters detailed a business arrangement between Master Garrett and several men in Charleston, something involving shipments that arrived at night, cargo that was never recorded in any official manifest, and profits that were quietly divided among a small group of conspirators. But the letters never explicitly stated what was being shipped. They referred only to cargo and merchandise and the arrangement. There were 12 letters in total, spanning from 1838 to 1856. The most recent one, dated just 3 months ago, carried a tone of barely concealed panic. The investigation in Charleston has made several of us nervous. Senator Williams assures me that no evidence links us to the operation, but I strongly advise burning all correspondence related to our past transactions. If the federal authorities discover what we moved through Georgia in the 40s, none of us will escape prosecution. Samuel returned the letters exactly as he had found them, his mind working furiously. He understood now why Master Garrett had seemed afraid in that overheard conversation. Whatever business he had been involved in, it was illegal and dangerous enough to warrant federal investigation even now, years after the fact. But what was being moved through Riverside Manor, and how did it connect to this house's strange acoustic architecture? Over the following weeks, Samuel mapped the hidden passages with the meticulousness of a surveyor. He worked slowly, careful never to spend too long in any one room or ask questions that might draw attention. But gradually, he identified 5 specific locations in the house where the acoustic effect was strongest. Places where you could press your ear to a baseboard or air vent and hear conversations from rooms that should have been out of range. The first was in the second-floor guest bedroom, where he had initially discovered the phenomenon. The second was in the small linen closet off the main staircase, which somehow channeled sound from Master Garrett's study with perfect clarity. The third was in the attic, behind a loose panel, where voices from the dining room below rose up through a chimney chase. The fourth was in the basement storage room, where a gap in the foundation wall carried sounds from the library on the floor above. The fifth, and most disturbing, was in the quarters where Samuel himself lived, a small room off the kitchen house. There, in the corner behind his sleeping pallet, a crack in the plaster revealed another hollow space. And through this space, he could hear everything spoken in Mistress Garrett's private sitting room, directly above. He had been living beside a listening post for years without knowing it. The realization brought a sick feeling to his stomach. Had someone been listening to him? To the quiet conversations he had with other enslaved people who sometimes visited his room? To his prayers, spoken in darkness before sleeping? Or was he meant to be the listener? This last thought came to him late one night as he lay awake, staring at that crack in the plaster. The acoustic passages connected his quarters to the family's private spaces. They allowed him to hear conversations that no enslaved person would normally be permitted to witness. And his position in the house, trusted carpenter with access to every room, gave him both the mobility and the excuse to discover these channels. What if someone had wanted an enslaved person to have this access? What if the house itself was designed to create informants? The thought kept him awake until dawn. Samuel began listening deliberately after that, though the act filled him with equal parts dread and compulsion. He told himself he needed to understand what Master Garrett was involved in, that this knowledge might somehow protect him or the other people who lived and worked at Riverside. But truthfully, he listened because silence had become intolerable. For 32 years, he had moved through this house as furniture, as tool, as property. The voices in the walls made him human again, someone capable of witnessing, of knowing, of judging. It was dangerous humanity, but humanity nonetheless. On the first Tuesday in April, Samuel was working in the small linen closet when he heard Master Garrett's voice rising from the study below. The wagon arrives at midnight. I want everyone away from the East Fields. No one sees anything. No one hears anything. What about the house workers? Another voice. Mr. Bennett, the plantation overseer. Send them to their quarters after supper. No exceptions. And Bennett, make sure the doors to the east wing are locked from the inside. I don't want anyone wandering. Samuel's hands stilled on the shelf he was supposedly repairing. This was it. The shipment mentioned in that overheard conversation weeks ago. That night, Samuel lay on his pallet fully clothed, waiting. The house settled around him with its usual creaks and whispers. At 11:30, he heard footsteps crossing the yard outside, Master Garrett and Mr. Bennett moving toward the east side of the property. Samuel rose and moved to his door. It was locked from the outside, as Garrett had ordered, but Samuel had been a carpenter for 18 years, and he knew every flaw in every lock in this house. He used a thin piece of metal, slid it into the gap beside the frame, and felt the bolt slide free. The night was moonless and warm. Samuel stayed in the shadows, moving along the edge of the kitchen garden until he reached the split-rail fence that bordered the east fields. From here, he could see the road that led to the river landing and the dark shapes of two wagons making their way slowly up the path. The wagons stopped near a small barn that was used for equipment storage. Master Garrett appeared with a lantern, and in its light, Samuel saw 3 other men he didn't recognize. Rough-looking individuals who moved with the efficient purposefulness of people who had done this many times before. They began unloading the wagons. The cargo was not cotton or tobacco or any legitimate trade good. It was wooden crates, perhaps 24 of them, each one about 3 feet long and unmarked. The men carried them into the barn quickly, speaking in low voices that didn't carry across the field. The entire operation took less than 30 minutes. Then the wagons turned and headed back down toward the river, and the men dispersed. Samuel waited until he was certain they were gone, then crept closer to the barn. The door was secured with a new padlock, but the barn's construction was old and loose. Samuel found a gap between 2 boards wide enough to peer through. Inside, the crates were stacked against the far wall. By the faint starlight coming through the barn's ventilation slats, he could just make out writing stenciled on the sides of several crates. Machinery parts. Savannah Foundry. But Samuel knew the Savannah Foundry. He had once repaired furniture for a merchant who supplied them, and he remembered that the foundry marked all legitimate shipments with a registration number and date. These crates had no such markings. Samuel returned to his locked room and slipped back inside, replacing the bolt as carefully as he had released it. He lay awake until dawn, mind churning with questions. What was in those crates? Why were they being hidden at Riverside? And what would Master Garrett do if he discovered that someone had witnessed the delivery? The answer to that last question came sooner than Samuel expected. 2 days after the midnight shipment, a young woman named Ruth was brought to Riverside Manor in chains. She was perhaps 25 years old, thin and exhausted, with a fresh brand on her left shoulder that marked her as a runaway. Master Garrett had purchased her at auction in Augusta, according to the whispered conversation in the kitchen house, and paid an unusually high price, despite her status as a fugitive. Ruth was put to work immediately in the kitchen, under the harsh supervision of Mistress Garrett's personal housekeeper. But Samuel noticed something strange. Ruth never spoke. Not a single word, even when directly addressed. She communicated only through nods and gestures, and her eyes carried a wariness that went beyond normal fear. On her 3rd day at Riverside, Samuel was repairing a cabinet in the kitchen when Ruth approached him. She glanced around to make sure they were alone, then leaned close and whispered. The first words he had heard her speak. "I know about the walls." Samuel's blood went cold. He forced himself to continue working, keeping his expression neutral. "I don't know what you mean." "Yes, you do." Ruth's voice was barely audible. "I was here before. 7 years ago. I worked in the laundry house." Samuel set down his hammer carefully. "Why did you come back?" "I didn't have a choice. Master Garrett sent men to find me." Ruth's hands were shaking as she kneaded bread dough, the motion automatic. "They tracked me to Cincinnati. When they brought me back, Master Garrett said if I ever told anyone what I learned in this house, he would make sure I disappeared." "What did you learn?" Ruth shook her head. "Not here. Tonight. Your room. Wait until everyone is asleep." She moved away before Samuel could respond, returning to her work with the same mechanical efficiency she had shown since arriving. But Samuel's mind was racing. Ruth had been at Riverside 7 years ago, 1850. That was well within the time frame of the letters he had found, and whatever she knew had been important enough that Master Garrett had spent considerable money and effort to bring her back. That night, long after the house had gone dark and silent, Samuel heard the soft scratch at his door. He opened it to find Ruth standing in the shadows, wrapped in a thin shawl against the cool spring air. "The walls have ears," she said without preamble. "Did you know that? The whole house is built to carry sound. Master Garrett's grandfather designed it that way." Samuel gestured her inside and closed the door. Why? To spy on his own family. Ruth moved to the corner where Samuel's pallet lay and pointed to the crack in the plaster, the same crack Samuel had discovered weeks ago. The old master, he was obsessed with knowing everything. He didn't trust his wife, his children, his business partners. So he built a house where he could hear every conversation, every secret. He had listening posts in his study, his bedroom, even his private office in the barn. "How do you know this?" "I found papers. Same as you, probably." Ruth's voice was steady now, as if telling the story had given her strength. 7 years ago, I was cleaning in the old master's office. That's the library now. And I knocked over a shelf. Behind it was a journal. The original plans for the house, with notes about where the listening passages were located and how to access them. Samuel felt his pulse quicken. What happened to the journal? Master Garrett caught me reading it. Ruth's expression darkened. He was very angry. He took the journal and told me I would be sold immediately if I spoke of it to anyone. But I was young and stupid. I told another woman who worked in the house, thinking we could use this information somehow. Maybe prove that Master Garrett was listening to our conversations. Get him in trouble with the other plantation owners. What did she do? She disappeared. Ruth's voice cracked slightly. 3 days after I told her she was gone. Master Garrett said she'd been sold to a plantation in Florida, but no one ever found record of the sale. She just stopped existing. The small room felt suddenly colder. Samuel thought about the midnight shipments, the crates in the barn, the terrified tone in Master Garrett's letters. "That's when I ran," Ruth continued. "I made it to Cincinnati, found work, started to think I might actually have a life. But they found me, and Master Garrett brought me back personally, just to tell me that I should have kept silent. Why did he keep you alive?" I wondered that too. Ruth pulled her shawl tighter. "But I think I understand now. He brought me back as a message to everyone in this house. If you learn something you shouldn't, if you try to tell anyone, you end up like me, branded, broken, a warning." Samuel absorbed this in silence. Then he asked the question that had been burning in his mind since the midnight delivery. "What's in those crates?" Ruth's eyes widened. "You saw them Tuesday night. They unloaded about 24 crates into the east barn." For a long moment, Ruth said nothing. Then, "I don't know exactly what's in them, but 7 years ago when I found that journal, there were other papers with it. Shipping manifests, accounts, names of people in Charleston and Savannah. Master Garrett's grandfather wasn't just spying on his family. He was smuggling. Smuggling what? Anything that paid. Furs, tobacco, rum, weapons during the war with Britain." Ruth paused. "And people." The word hung in the air between them like a physical presence. "You mean enslaved people?" Samuel asked slowly. "I mean, people who were supposed to be free. People who had bought their freedom, or been freed by their owners, or escaped and made lives in the North." Ruth's voice was shaking now. The journal mentioned reversals. That's what the old master called them. He would work with traders who specialized in kidnapping free black people and bringing them south to be sold back into slavery. The acoustic system in the house let him coordinate these operations without anyone overhearing. He could meet with the traders, make arrangements, plan the kidnappings, all while appearing to be a respectable plantation owner. Samuel felt sick. And Master Garrett continued this. The journal made it seem like it stopped after the old master died in 1842, but now, Ruth gestured toward the crack in the wall, toward the network of listening passages that ran throughout the house. If he's receiving shipments in secret, If he's scared enough to track me down after 7 years, maybe it never stopped. Maybe he just got better at hiding it. Samuel did not sleep that night. He lay in darkness, listening to the familiar sounds of the house settling. But now every creak and whisper seemed sinister. The walls that had witnessed so many secrets were themselves a secret. A machine designed for conspiracy, operating in plain sight for 66 years. If Ruth was right, then those crates in the barn didn't contain machinery parts. They contained something far more valuable and terrible. But Samuel needed proof. Suspicions and stolen conversations weren't enough. If he was going to act on what he knew, and the fact that he was even considering action terrified him, he needed concrete evidence. Over the next week, Samuel became obsessed with the acoustic network. He would lie in his room at night, ear pressed to that crack in the plaster, listening to Mistress Garrett's private conversations with her visiting friends. He learned about debts and social rivalries, about her growing concern over her husband's business problems, about her suspicion that something at Riverside was not quite proper. From his listening post in the linen closet, he heard Master Garrett arguing with Mr. Bennett about security. "I want every field hand accounted for at night. Any unexplained absence gets reported immediately. And make sure the new woman, Ruth, is never left unsupervised in the main house." From the attic panel, he heard a conversation between two of Master Garrett's business associates from Savannah. "The Charleston matter is nearly resolved. Senator Williams managed to suppress the investigation. As long as the federal inspector never sees the manifest from 47 to 52, we're protected." Each fragment was damning, but fragmentary. Samuel needed to access those crates in the barn. He needed to know what they actually contained. His opportunity came on a humid Saturday in late April. Master Garrett left Riverside early that morning, heading to Augusta for what he claimed would be a 3-day trip. Mistress Garrett took the opportunity to visit her sister in Macon, taking the household's senior staff with her. This left the plantation under Mr. Bennett's supervision, but Bennett was lazy and spent most of his time in the overseer's cottage on the far side of the property. Samuel waited until afternoon, when the field hands were spread across the cotton acreage, and the remaining house staff were occupied with their usual tasks. Then he took his tools and walked calmly toward the east barn, as if he had business there. The new padlock was formidable, but the barn's construction was not. Samuel found a loose board near the back wall and used his pry bar to create a gap just wide enough to squeeze through. Inside, the crates were exactly where he'd seen them on the night of the delivery, stacked against the far wall. Samuel approached the nearest one and examined it carefully. The wood was fresh pine, assembled recently. The stenciled marking, "Machinery Parts, Savannah Foundry," was actually a stamp, applied with a rubber seal that had left slightly smudged edges. These crates had been marked deliberately to look legitimate, but they were not legitimate shipments. Samuel selected a crate from the middle of the stack and used his pry bar carefully to loosen the nailed lid. The wood creaked as it came free, loud in the still barn. He paused, listening, but heard only the distant sounds of the plantation at work. Inside the crate was cloth, heavy canvas, folded multiple times. Samuel lifted the layers carefully and felt his breath stop. Beneath the canvas were manacles. Dozens of them, all new, still wrapped in oiled paper to prevent rust. And beneath the manacles were documents, printed handbills advertising rewards for runaway slaves, blank certificates of ownership, and several official-looking forms from various county clerks' offices in South Carolina and Georgia. These were the tools of the slave-catching trade, the equipment necessary to capture, restrain, and provide false documentation for people who would then be sold at auction. But there was more. At the bottom of the crate, wrapped in oilcloth, was a ledger. Samuel lifted it out with shaking hands. The ledger was new, its pages still crisp, but the entries inside dated back several months. January 15th, 1857. 2 individuals secured in Philadelphia. Transport to Charleston arranged. Estimated value $1,800. February 3rd, 1857, 4 individuals secured in Richmond. High risk due to literacy. Transport delayed but completed February 18th. Estimated value $3,400. March 9th, 1857, 1 individual secured in Washington. Premium documentation required. Transport completed March 22nd. Estimated value $1,200. The entries continued month after month, each one representing human beings kidnapped from freedom and sold back into slavery. And at the bottom of each entry was a notation. Share to RMG, 30%. RMG. Robert Montgomery Garrett, Master Garrett himself. Samuel stood in the dim barn, holding evidence of a conspiracy that stretched from Georgia to Pennsylvania, involving dozens of people over years. This wasn't just smuggling, this was a coordinated operation to kidnap free black people across the North and Upper South, forge documents claiming they were escaped slaves, and sell them at auction to plantations throughout the Deep South. And Riverside Manor, with its acoustic surveillance system, its hidden passages, its respectable facade, was at the center of it. Samuel returned the ledger to the crate and carefully replaced the lid, tapping the nails back into position. He slipped out of the barn the same way he had entered, replaced the loose board, and walked back to the main house with his tools, moving like a man underwater. His mind was screaming. Every instinct told him to forget what he had seen to survive, to protect himself. What could one enslaved carpenter do against a conspiracy this large and this protected? Master Garrett had connections to senators and federal inspectors. The men involved in this operation were powerful enough to suppress investigations and track fugitives across state lines. But Samuel kept seeing those entries in the ledger. 2 individuals secured in Philadelphia. 4 individuals secured in Richmond. Each one represented people who had thought they were safe, who had built lives in freedom, only to be torn away and dragged south in chains. People like Ruth, who had made it all the way to Cincinnati before being captured and returned. People who were being erased from existence as if freedom had never touched them. That night, Samuel lay in his room and listened to the walls. The house whispered around him. Distant conversations, footsteps on creaking boards, the small sounds of a structure settling under its own weight. But now he understood what he was hearing, the mechanism of silence, the architecture of secrets. This house had been built to keep conspiracies hidden, to allow terrible things to be planned and executed without witness. But someone was witnessing now. Around midnight, Ruth appeared at his door again. She looked exhausted, her hands raw from the harsh kitchen work she'd been assigned. "Did you find what you needed?" "Yes." Samuel's voice was hollow. "You were right. All of it. Then what are we going to do?" The question hung in the air. Samuel had been avoiding it, but now there was no escape. What can we do? If I try to tell anyone, the county sheriff, a magistrate, they'll never believe me. I'm an enslaved man accusing one of the wealthiest planters in Georgia. They'd say I stole the documents or forged them, or that I'm lying to cause trouble. What about someone in the North? An abolitionist newspaper? How would I even contact them? And even if I could, how long before Master Garrett found out? Before I ended up dead in a field somewhere, with everyone told I tried to run? Ruth sank down against the wall. So we just let it continue? Let him keep destroying lives? I don't know. The words came out sharper than Samuel intended. He took a breath, forcing calm. I need to think. There has to be a way, but I can't see it yet. Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then, the voices in the walls. Master Garrett doesn't know you can hear them, does he? I don't think so. Why? Because he still uses this house the way his grandfather did, to coordinate things in secret. Which means he'll talk about the operation. Maybe reveal something we can use. A name, a contact, something that could bring the whole thing down. Samuel understood what she was suggesting. You want me to keep listening. I want us to be ready. Sooner or later, Master Garrett will make a mistake. He'll say something or do something that gives us leverage. And when that happens, we need to know enough to act. It was a desperate plan, built on hope and patience that Samuel wasn't sure he possessed. But it was a plan. "All right," he said finally. "I'll listen." May arrived with oppressive heat and the constant hum of insects in the fields. Samuel moved through his days maintaining the careful facade of the unobtrusive servant, but his nights were spent pressed against the walls, listening. He heard Master Garrett arguing with his wife about finances, about the growing debts that threatened to consume Riverside's legitimate income. He heard Mistress Garrett pleading with her husband to abandon whatever dangerous enterprise you've involved yourself in before it destroyed them all. He heard Master Garrett meeting with his associates in the study, their voices rising through the hidden channels to Samuel's listening post in the linen closet. The federal inspector has been reassigned to Louisiana. Senator Williams confirmed it. We're clear for now. What about the cargo scheduled for June? Proceed as planned. We have 4 acquisitions confirmed in Baltimore and 3 more possible in Cincinnati. The documentation is already prepared. He heard Mr. Bennett reporting to Master Garrett about an enslaved man from a neighboring plantation who had been asking questions about people who disappeared. I told the man's owner. He's been dealt with, won't be asking any more questions. Samuel recorded everything in his memory, creating a mental map of the conspiracy. He learned names. Senator James Williams in Charleston, a lawyer named Preston who specialized in forged documents, a slave trader named Holt who operated out of Richmond, a corrupt sheriff in Augusta who provided false arrest warrants. But knowledge without power was torture. Each conversation Samuel overheard was evidence of another crime, another destroyed life, another person erased, and he could do nothing but listen and remember. In mid-May, Ruth brought him news that made everything more urgent. They're planning something big. I heard Master Garrett talking to Mr. Bennett. There's going to be a meeting here at Riverside. All the main people involved in the operation coming together to plan something they called the expansion. When? First week of June. Master Garrett is sending most of the staff away. Told everyone there would be important business guests and he wants minimal interruption. Ruth's voice was tense. This might be our only chance to hear them all together, to get the full scope of what they're planning. Samuel nodded slowly. If we're going to do something, we need to do it during that meeting. Gather everything we can, every name, every detail. And then we find someone who can't be bought or threatened, someone with enough power to bring this conspiracy into the light. It sounded impossible even as he said it. But what was the alternative? To listen forever, collecting atrocities in his memory while doing nothing. The first week of June transformed Riverside Manor. Master Garrett sent most of the enslaved population to work in the distant fields, keeping only a skeleton staff to maintain the main house. Samuel was among those kept close, ostensibly to handle any necessary repairs during the important business meetings. In reality, he suspected Master Garrett simply didn't trust him out of sight. Though the master had no specific reason for this distrust, it was the general paranoia of a man engaged in criminal enterprise. Ruth remained as well, assigned to kitchen work under strict supervision. She and Samuel barely had opportunities to speak, but they communicated through glances and small gestures, maintaining the appearance of strangers while preparing for what was to come. The guests began arriving on Tuesday, June 2nd. Samuel watched from the window as carriages rolled up the long drive, expensive vehicles carrying well-dressed men who looked like respectable businessmen and politicians. 7 men in total, each one greeted personally by Master Garrett with the warm handshakes of old friends. That evening, the men gathered in the dining room for dinner. Samuel was assigned to help serve, moving between the table and the kitchen with plates and wine bottles, making himself invisible as he had learned to do decades ago. But he listened to every word. The conversation was careful at first. Discussion of cotton prices, politics, the growing tension between North and South over the question of new territories. But as the wine flowed and the evening deepened, the talk became more relaxed, more honest. The expansion to Illinois is risky, one man was saying. Samuel recognized him from earlier introductions as Senator Williams. The population there is increasingly hostile to our particular trade. We've operated in hostile territory before, another responded, the lawyer Preston. The key is documentation. As long as the papers appear legitimate, no one can prove otherwise. Papers didn't save the Richmond operation, a third man interjected. They were exposed by that damn newspaper reporter. 3 good men ended up in prison. That was carelessness, Master Garrett said sharply. They kept written records, detailed accounts. I've told you all, nothing in writing except the bare minimum for coordination. Everything else stays in memory. Samuel felt his heart sink. If Garrett was disciplined about avoiding written records, the ledger in the barn might be the only concrete evidence. Speaking of memory, Senator Williams said, and his tone shifted to something more ominous. We need to discuss the security problem. The woman you brought back from Cincinnati, Ruth. Is she contained? Completely, Garrett replied. She understands what will happen if she speaks. Understanding and silence aren't the same thing. Perhaps she should be permanently secured. Samuel nearly dropped the wine bottle he was holding. He forced his hands steady, his expression blank. Master Garrett was quiet for a moment. Then, that may become necessary. But for now, she's useful as a warning to anyone else who might be tempted to talk. The conversation moved on to logistics, schedules for upcoming acquisitions, contacts in northern cities, methods for transporting captives south without attracting attention. Samuel listened to it all, committing every detail to memory, even as rage built in his chest like a physical pressure. These men spoke of human beings as cargo. They discussed kidnapping and imprisonment the way other businessmen might discuss shipping routes and inventory. And they did it over fine wine and roasted meat in a dining room lit by crystal chandeliers, while enslaved people served them with downcast eyes. After dinner, the men moved to Master Garrett's study for brandy and cigars. Samuel was dismissed, sent back to his quarters while the senior house staff cleaned the dining room. But he didn't go to his room. Instead, he made his way to the linen closet, to his listening post that connected directly to Garrett's study. The voices rose clearly through the walls. The primary concern is federal involvement. If the Interior Department launches a formal investigation, our connections to Senator Williams won't be enough to stop it. Then we need to move quickly with the expansion, generate enough profit to buy additional protection. How many acquisitions are we planning for the Illinois territory? 20, possibly 30 over the next 6 months. Holt has contacts in Chicago who can identify targets, people who've been free long enough to have accumulated property or savings. Those are worth the most. And the transport route? River barges down to St. Louis, then overland to Memphis. From Memphis, they're distributed to buyers throughout Mississippi and Alabama. New identities, new documentation. No trace back to their free lives. Samuel closed his eyes, overwhelmed by the scale of what he was hearing. This wasn't just a small conspiracy. It was an organized system, operating across multiple states, involving senators and lawyers and sheriffs. Dozens of people working together to kidnap, enslave, and erase free black men, women, and children. And then he heard something that changed everything. "What about the auction in Charleston?" someone asked. "I heard there were complications." "Nothing serious," Master Garrett replied. "A man we acquired in Baltimore last month, he claimed to have proof of his free status. Made quite a scene at the auction block, insisting he was born free in Philadelphia, that he had papers at home. Did anyone believe him? Of course not. But it drew attention. A newspaper editor started asking questions, wanted to investigate the man's claims. Garrett's voice hardened. We had to take care of the editor. Made it look like a robbery gone wrong." Silence followed this admission. Then Senator Williams spoke, his voice cold. "You murdered a newspaper editor? We eliminated a threat to the operation. There's a difference." "Not to the authorities, there isn't. If anyone connects that death to our business, they won't. I made sure of it." The conversation shifted to other matters, but Samuel remained frozen in the closet, his blood like ice. They had killed someone, not just kidnapped or enslaved, murdered, because a newspaper editor asked questions. This was worse than he had imagined, and Samuel realized with absolute certainty that if Master Garrett discovered Samuel knew about any of this, he would end up dead as well. Probably Ruth too. Probably anyone who posed even the slightest risk to the conspiracy. Samuel didn't sleep that night. He sat in his room, listening to the usual whispers through the walls, trying to form some kind of plan from the chaos of information in his mind. Around 3 a.m, Ruth appeared at his door. She looked as exhausted as he felt. "I heard you moving around," she whispered. "What happened?" Samuel told her everything. The dinner conversation, the discussion in the study, the admission of murder. Ruth's face went pale in the dim candlelight. "We have to leave," she said flatly. "Tonight. Just run." "And go where?" "They tracked you all the way to Cincinnati. They have contacts across the north." "We wouldn't make it 20 miles before they found us." "Then what? We just wait here until they decide we're too dangerous to keep alive?" Samuel was quiet for a long moment. Then, "There's one person who might help. Someone with the authority to investigate who can't be bought by Senator Williams." "Who?" "I don't know his name, but I heard the men talking about him. A federal inspector from the Interior Department who's been investigating slave trading irregularities. They said he was reassigned to Louisiana, but that was done specifically to keep him away from Georgia, which means he was close to finding something." Ruth frowned. "How does that help us? Because if he was reassigned for political reasons, he knows something is wrong. And if we can get information to him, real evidence, names, details about the operation, he might be able to restart the investigation. How are we supposed to contact a federal inspector? We can't even leave the plantation." Samuel had been thinking about this. "The guests are leaving tomorrow. Master Garrett is traveling with Senator Williams to Charleston to handle business. That means he'll be gone for several days, and the staff will be less vigilant without him here. You want to steal the ledger, and anything else I can find. Then we get it to someone who can carry it north, maybe a free black traveler on the River Road, someone who can reach federal authorities in Washington." It was a terrible plan, full of risk and unlikely success, but Ruth nodded slowly. "When?" "Tomorrow night after the guests have left. I'll get into the barn, take the ledger and whatever documentation I can carry. You pack whatever food you can steal from the kitchen, enough for several days. If this works, we'll need to disappear immediately. And if it doesn't work..." Samuel met her eyes. "Then at least we tried." Wednesday afternoon, the guests departed Riverside Manor one by one, their fancy carriages rolling back down the long drive toward the main road. Master Garrett left last, riding with Senator Williams toward Charleston, and the plantation seemed to exhale with relief at his departure. Mistress Garrett retreated to her rooms with instructions not to be disturbed. Mr. Bennett settled into his usual routine of minimal supervision. The house staff moved through their work with the slightly lighter air of people whose primary taskmaster was absent. Samuel waited until well after midnight. The house had been dark and quiet for hours when he finally rose from his pallet, fully dressed. He had a canvas bag prepared, small enough to conceal, large enough to hold a ledger and whatever papers he could gather. The night was humid and moonless. Samuel made his way across the grounds using paths he had traveled thousands of times, every sound amplified by fear. When he reached the east barn, he used the same loose board he had discovered before, squeezing through the gap in the wall. The crates were still there, stacked exactly as they had been. Samuel selected the one he knew contained the ledger and carefully pried the lid free. The manacles glinted in the faint starlight, coming through gaps in the roof. He pushed through them to reach the oilcloth package at the bottom. The ledger was there, exactly where he remembered. Samuel was wrapping it in his canvas bag when he heard voices outside. He froze, his heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. The voices were getting closer, 2 men, talking in low tones. "Check the barn every night while the master's away. He was very specific about that." Seems like a waste of time to me. Who's going to break into a barn? Just do what you're told. The footsteps stopped directly outside the barn door. Samuel heard the rattle of the padlock being tested, confirmed secure. He pressed himself against the wall, barely breathing, praying they wouldn't notice the loose board at the back. For an eternal moment, nothing happened. Then one of the voices said, "Everything looks fine. Let's get back." The footsteps retreated. Samuel waited until he was absolutely certain they were gone before allowing himself to breathe normally again. He replaced the lid of the crate, tapping the nails in as quietly as possible. Then he slipped back through the gap in the barn wall, the ledger secure in his canvas bag. The walk back to his room felt like miles instead of yards. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound a potential discovery. But he made it back without incident, slipped inside, and locked the door from within. Only then did he allow himself to look at what he had stolen. The ledger was even more damning than he remembered. It didn't just list acquisitions, it detailed the entire process. Names of victims before they were captured, their occupations, their locations, sometimes even notes about their families. Then their new identities after being sold, the plantations that purchased them, the prices paid. And throughout it all, Master Garrett's share of the profits. But there was something else in the ledger, something Samuel hadn't noticed during his first examination. At the back were several folded letters, tucked into a pocket sewn into the leather binding. Samuel unfolded them carefully. They were correspondence between Master Garrett and a man named Inspector David Morrison of the Interior Department, the very inspector the conspirators had been worried about. The letters made Samuel's hands shake as he read them. Inspector Morrison, I write to inform you of serious irregularities I have observed regarding slave auctions in Charleston and Savannah. Several individuals claiming to be freeborn have appeared at these auctions, insisting they were kidnapped from northern cities. While such claims are often dismissed as desperate lies, the consistency of the accounts troubles me. I believe a formal investigation is warranted. The letter was dated September 1856. It was followed by additional correspondence detailing Morrison's growing suspicions and his attempts to gather evidence. The final letter, dated March 1857, was different. To whom it may concern, Inspector Morrison will no longer be continuing his investigation into irregular slave trading practices in Georgia and South Carolina. He has been reassigned to Louisiana, effective immediately. All case files related to this matter are considered closed. This final letter was signed by someone in the Interior Department's administrative office, clearly the result of Senator Williams's political intervention. But the important thing was the earlier correspondence. It proved that Morrison had been investigating this conspiracy. It proved he knew something was wrong. And it provided his last known location, the Interior Department office in New Orleans. Samuel now had a name, a location, and evidence. If he could somehow get this ledger and these letters to Inspector Morrison, the conspiracy could be exposed. But how? The answer came from an unexpected source. The next morning, a free black man arrived at Riverside Manor looking for work. His name was William. He carried papers proving his free status, and he was traveling the river road from Augusta to Savannah, taking whatever carpentry jobs he could find along the way. Mr. Bennett hired him to help repair storm damage to one of the equipment sheds, a 2-day job that required precise woodwork, which meant William would be working alongside Samuel. They spent Thursday morning measuring and cutting replacement boards, working in the easy silence of 2 men skilled in the same trade. But Samuel was thinking furiously. William was free. William was traveling to Savannah. And from Savannah, a letter could be posted to New Orleans. Around noon, when they were alone in the shed, Samuel took a risk. "Can I ask you something? In confidence?" William looked at him carefully. "Depends on the question." "How careful are you about keeping your free papers?" "Very careful. I've heard too many stories about free black folks getting picked up and sold south." William's expression hardened. "Why?" Samuel took a deep breath. "Because those stories are true and I have proof. He told William everything, in a hurried whisper, constantly watching for anyone who might overhear. He explained the conspiracy, the ledger, the kidnappings, Inspector Morrison's interrupted investigation. William listened in growing horror. "You're telling me there's an organized operation kidnapping free people across the north?" "Yes, and I have the evidence right here." Samuel touched the canvas bag he'd hidden beneath a pile of scrap wood. "But I need to get it to someone who can do something about it. A federal inspector in New Orleans." William was quiet for a long time. Finally, "If I help you and they find out, they'll kill me, papers or no papers." "I know. I wouldn't ask if there was any other way." "Why not just run? Take the evidence and head north yourself?" "Because they have contacts everywhere. They'd track me down before I made it 50 miles. But a free man traveling legitimately with carpentry tools and proper documentation, you can move openly. Post a letter. Get this evidence to someone with the authority to investigate." William looked away, clearly torn. Then,
"What happens to you and that woman Ruth if I do this?" "We disappear. As soon as you're clear of Riverside, we run. If we're lucky, we make it to Augusta or somewhere with enough people to hide. If not," Samuel shrugged, "at least the evidence will be safe." For a moment he thought William would refuse.
It was too much to ask of a stranger. Too much risk for someone who had managed to secure his own freedom and make a life. But William nodded slowly. "All right, I'll do it. But you need to write everything down, a letter explaining what's in the ledger, who Inspector Morrison is, why this matters. Make it clear and simple so he understands immediately." That evening, after the day's work was done, Samuel sat in his room with a stolen piece of paper and a carefully sharpened pencil. Writing was forbidden for enslaved people in Georgia, but Samuel had taught himself years ago, learning from scraps of newspapers and documents he found while working in the house. His handwriting was rough, but legible. He wrote, "Inspector Morrison, my name is Samuel. I am enslaved at Riverside Manor in Georgia. I have discovered evidence of a large conspiracy to kidnap free black people across the north and sell them into slavery in the Deep South. This ledger contains records of dozens of victims, along with the names of men involved in the operation, including Senator James Williams of Charleston. These men murdered a newspaper editor who tried to investigate them. They will kill me if they discover I know about this. Please investigate. Please help the people they have taken. Please stop them. Samuel, Riverside Manor, Georgia, June 1857. He wrapped the letter and the ledger carefully in oilcloth, then in canvas, creating a package that could survive travel. Early Friday morning, before dawn, he slipped out to the shed where William was staying and handed him the bundle. "The address is in the letter," Samuel whispered. "Interior Department, New Orleans. Mark it urgent." William tucked the package into his traveling bag, beneath his tools, where it wouldn't be easily found. "I'm leaving for Savannah this afternoon soon as I finish the repair work. I'll post this the day I arrive." "Thank you. I don't know how to—" "Don't thank me. Just stay alive long enough for this to matter." They shook hands and Samuel felt the weight of desperate hope settling over him. Maybe this would work. Maybe Inspector Morrison would receive the evidence, restart his investigation, bring the conspiracy crashing down. Or maybe Samuel had just signed his own death warrant. Master Garrett returned from Charleston on Saturday afternoon, 3 days earlier than expected. Samuel was repairing a window in the main hallway when the carriage rolled up the drive. His stomach dropped. Garrett was supposed to be gone until Tuesday. Something had changed. The master strode into the house with barely controlled fury, calling for Mr. Bennet and Mistress Garrett. Samuel made himself invisible in the corner, continuing his work while listening intently. "There's been a breach," Garrett was saying, his voice tight. "Someone in Charleston received a letter, anonymous, detailing aspects of our operation, names, dates, methods. Not everything, but enough to be dangerous." Samuel's blood went cold. A letter, but William had only left yesterday afternoon. He couldn't have reached Savannah yet, couldn't have posted anything. "Do we know who sent it?" Mr. Bennet asked. "No, but it was postmarked from Augusta 3 days ago, which means someone local, someone with access to information they shouldn't have." Samuel's mind raced. Someone else knew about the conspiracy, or was this a coincidence, unrelated to his own stolen evidence? "I want everyone questioned," Garrett continued. "Every person who works on this property, enslaved or free. Someone knows something, and I will find out who." The interrogations began that evening. Mr. Bennett assembled all the house staff in the main hall, and Master Garrett questioned each person individually. Where they had been over the past week, who they had spoken to, whether they had noticed anything unusual. The questions were sharp and specific, designed to catch inconsistencies. When Samuel's turn came, he forced himself to remain calm. He answered each question directly, honestly where possible, careful where necessary. No, he hadn't left the plantation. No, he hadn't spoken to anyone from outside Riverside. Yes, he had been working on repairs throughout the house, but he never entered rooms without permission. Garrett stared at him for a long moment, and Samuel felt the weight of that scrutiny like a physical pressure. But finally the master dismissed him with a curt nod. Ruth was questioned next. Samuel waited in the hallway, listening to the rise and fall of voices through the door. He couldn't make out specific words, but he heard Garrett's anger growing sharper. After 20 minutes, the door opened and Ruth stumbled out, her face pale. Mr. Bennett grabbed her arm. "Take her to the cellar. Lock her in until Master Garrett decides what to do with her." "No." Ruth's voice cracked with fear. "I didn't do anything. I don't know about any letter." "That's what we're going to determine," Garrett said coldly from inside the room. "Take her away." Samuel watched helplessly as Ruth was dragged toward the cellar stairs. Their eyes met briefly, and in that instant he saw her terror and her accusation. This was his fault. His investigation, his stolen evidence, had brought Garrett's suspicion down on everyone. That night, Samuel lay in his room, listening to the walls. But the whispers brought no comfort now, only dread. He heard Garrett pacing in his study, heard Mistress Garrett begging her husband to abandon this madness before it destroys us all. Heard Mr. Bennett reporting on the interrogations. No one has confessed, but the woman, Ruth, she knows something. I'm certain of it. Break her then. Use whatever methods necessary. I need to know who sent that letter to Charleston. Samuel pressed his hands against his face, trying not to imagine what whatever methods necessary meant. Ruth was locked in the cellar because of him. She would be tortured because of him. And if she broke under the pressure, if she told them about his investigation, about the stolen ledger, he forced the thought away. William had left yesterday with the evidence. By now he should be in Savannah or close to it. Another day, maybe two, and the package would be posted to New Orleans. Inspector Morrison would receive it, and the conspiracy would be exposed. Samuel just had to survive until then, and somehow he had to protect Ruth. Sunday morning brought a development that changed everything. Samuel was working in the second-floor hallway, the same hallway where he had first discovered the voices in the walls months ago. He was alone, carefully replacing sections of baseboard that had warped in the summer humidity. And as he worked, he heard Master Garrett's voice rising through the hidden acoustic channels. "I don't care what you have to do, Bennett. That woman knows something, and I need to know what she knows before this situation gets worse. I've been questioning her all night, sir. She insists she's innocent. Then you're not pressing hard enough. Increase the pressure. And if she still won't talk..." Garrett's voice dropped lower, harder. "Then make her disappear, quietly. Same as the editor in Charleston." Samuel froze, the hammer loose in his hand. They were going to kill Ruth, not as a maybe, not as a possibility, as a certainty. If she didn't confess to something she didn't do, they would murder her and bury the body somewhere on the plantation's vast acreage. And there was nothing Samuel could do to stop it. Or was there? An idea began forming in his mind, desperate and dangerous, but possible. The house's acoustic system carried sound in both directions. If voices from the study could travel to listening posts throughout the building, Then voices from those listening posts could potentially travel back to the study. What if Garrett could be made to confess to his crimes in his own house? What if Samuel could use the walls themselves as witnesses? But witnesses for whom? Samuel couldn't go to local authorities. They were either complicit or too intimidated by Garrett's influence to act. And William wouldn't reach New Orleans for weeks, assuming he even made it there safely. Unless... Samuel thought back to the overheard conversations, the fragments of information he had gathered over months of listening. One name kept appearing in relation to the failed investigation. Judge Cartwright of Augusta. He was mentioned as sympathetic to abolitionist causes, and someone the conspirators worried about. If Cartwright had been involved in Morrison's original investigation, he might still be looking for evidence. Augusta was only 2 days' travel from Riverside. If Samuel could somehow get proof of Garrett's crimes to Judge Cartwright, not just stolen documents, but a confession in Garrett's own voice, witnessed by someone who couldn't be dismissed or threatened. But how could Samuel record a confession? How could he preserve something spoken out loud? The answer came from an unlikely source, the journals in Garrett's study. Samuel had seen them many times while cleaning, leather-bound books where Garrett recorded business transactions, plantation expenses, personal notes. The master was meticulous about his record-keeping, at least for his legitimate activities. What if Samuel could somehow trick Garrett into confessing on paper? Or better yet, trick him into confessing in front of a witness who could testify? The plan began taking shape in Samuel's mind, each piece clicking into place with terrifying clarity. It was insane. It would almost certainly fail. But it was the only chance Ruth had. Samuel spent Sunday afternoon preparing. He moved through the house, gathering specific items. A piece of fine writing paper from Mistress Garrett's desk, a wax seal that matched Senator Williams's personal mark. Samuel had seen it on letters in the study. Ink that matched the senator's preferred dark blue. Then he retreated to his room and carefully wrote a letter. His handwriting was rough, so he worked slowly, making his letters as elegant and official-looking as possible. The letter read, Garrett, the Augusta situation has become critical. Judge Cartwright has obtained testimony from the Baltimore acquisition who made claims at the Charleston auction. He's preparing to file federal charges. We need to meet immediately to coordinate our response. I will arrive at Riverside Tuesday morning. Destroy all evidence before my arrival. This must be handled with absolute discretion. Williams. It was a forgery, and not a perfect one. But it didn't need to be perfect. It just needed to be convincing enough to make Garrett panic, to make him believe his conspiracy was about to be exposed. That night, long after the house had gone silent, Samuel slipped out of his room and made his way to the main entrance. Mail was delivered to Riverside 3 times a week, left in a box at the end of the long drive. Samuel walked the quarter-mile in darkness, placed the forged letter in the box as if it had been delivered by courier, and returned to his room. Monday morning, Mr. Bennet collected the mail as usual and brought it to Master Garrett during breakfast. Samuel was setting the table in the dining room when he saw Garrett read the letter. The master's face went white, then red. His hands shook as he read it a second time. Bennet, get in here, Garrett called, his voice strained. We have a serious problem. Samuel left the room quickly, but he positioned himself in the nearby linen closet, his listening post that connected directly to the study where Garrett and Bennet had retreated. Senator Williams is coming tomorrow, Garrett was saying. There's been a development in Augusta. Apparently that man from Baltimore, the one who claimed to be free, he's given testimony to Judge Cartwright. They're preparing federal charges. How is that possible? Bennet sounded panicked. We made sure that man was sold to a plantation in Mississippi. He couldn't have testified to anyone. Obviously something went wrong. Someone got to him. Garrett's voice was sharp with fear. Williams says we need to destroy all evidence immediately. That means the ledgers, the correspondence, everything in the barn. What about the woman in the cellar? If there's going to be an investigation, she can't be found here. She's a loose end. Garrett was quiet for a moment. Take care of it tonight. Make it look like she tried to escape and drowned in the river. Samuel felt his stomach turn. They were going to kill Ruth tonight. Which meant his plan had to work now, or it was already too late. Monday afternoon, Samuel made a show of working on repairs in the East Wing. Visible, unremarkable, exactly where he was expected to be. But his mind was racing through the final steps of his desperate plan. At 4 o'clock, a carriage arrived at Riverside Manor. Samuel watched from a second-floor window as Judge Cartwright himself stepped out, accompanied by 2 other men Samuel didn't recognize. His forged letter had worked better than he'd dared hope. The fictional crisis had spooked Garrett enough that he'd sent an urgent message to Augusta, probably asking for legal counsel. And instead of sending a lawyer, Judge Cartwright had come himself, likely because Morrison's interrupted investigation had left the judge suspicious and looking for any reason to examine Riverside Manor more closely. Samuel heard Garrett greeting the judge in the front hall, his voice carefully controlled. "Judge Cartwright, what an unexpected honor, though I must admit I'm surprised to see you. My message requested a lawyer to advise on some business matters. I'm aware, but your message mentioned federal charges and testimony from Baltimore. Those are serious allegations that warrant judicial attention." Cartwright's voice was firm, authoritative. "I'd like to understand exactly what situation you're concerned about." They moved to the study. Samuel hurried to his listening post in the linen closet, arriving just as the conversation resumed. "I received a letter from Senator Williams," Garrett was saying. "He indicated there might be legal trouble stemming from testimony given by a man in Baltimore, someone claiming to be a free black person who was wrongly sold into slavery. And do you have any connection to such a case?" "None whatsoever, but the senator thought I should be aware, given my business relationships in Charleston." "I see." Cartwright sounded skeptical. "Mr. Garrett, I'll be direct with you. Inspector Morrison's investigation last year suggested there was a significant operation moving people through Georgia, free people being kidnapped and sold south. His investigation was shut down before he could gather sufficient evidence, but I've remained interested in the matter. So when I received your urgent request for legal counsel regarding federal charges and Baltimore testimony, naturally, I was curious." There was a long silence. Then Garrett said carefully, "I'm not sure what you're implying, Judge." "I'm not implying anything. I'm asking directly, do you have any knowledge of illegal slave trading operations in this region?" "Certainly not. The very suggestion is offensive." "Then you won't mind if I look around your property, just to satisfy my curiosity." Samuel's heart hammered. This was the moment. If Garrett refused the search, he would appear guilty, but Cartwright would have no evidence. If Garrett allowed the search and the judge found nothing, the crates might have already been moved, then the opportunity would be lost. But there was a third option. Samuel left the linen closet and moved quickly to the cellar stairs. Ruth was locked in a storage room at the bottom, guarded by one of Mr. Bennett's men. Samuel approached the guard with a message he'd prepared. "Master Garrett wants the woman brought to his study. Judge Cartwright wants to question her." It was a gamble. The guard might check with Garrett first, but Garrett was occupied with the judge, and the guard was lazy enough to appreciate having the decision made for him. He unlocked the cellar door and hauled Ruth out, her hands bound, face bruised from whatever interrogation she'd endured. As they climbed the stairs, Samuel whispered urgently, "Tell the judge everything. About the ledger, the kidnappings, all of it. This is your only chance." Ruth looked at him with wide, terrified eyes, but she nodded. The guard dragged Ruth to the study door and knocked. "Sir, you wanted to see the prisoner?" There was confusion in Garrett's voice. "What prisoner?" "I didn't," but Judge Cartwright interrupted. "Bring her in." The door opened. The guard pushed Ruth inside, and Samuel pressed his ear to his listening post, barely breathing. "Who is this woman?" Cartwright was asking. "A slave who's been causing trouble," Garrett said quickly. "She's confined for disciplinary reasons." "What kind of trouble?" Ruth's voice trembling but clear. "I'm confined because I know about the kidnappings. Because I know Master Garrett and his associates have been stealing free black people from northern cities and selling them south. Because 7 years ago I found evidence of this operation, and when I tried to tell someone, they threatened to kill me. That's absurd, Garrett sputtered. She's lying, trying to... Do you have evidence of these claims? Cartwright asked Ruth. There's a ledger in the east barn, hidden in crates marked as machinery parts. It has records of everyone they've kidnapped, where they were taken from, where they were sold. Master Garrett's name is on every page, showing his share of the profits. Samuel heard Garrett's voice, rising. This is slander. I'll have her whipped for... Mr. Bennett, Cartwright said sharply. Send for the county sheriff. And Mr. Garrett, I'm placing you under arrest pending investigation of these allegations. If there's a ledger in your barn, as this woman claims, we're going to find it. The ledger was found exactly where Ruth said it would be. Along with it, investigators discovered the manacles, the forged documents, and crates of materials used in the kidnapping operation. Within a week, Master Garrett, Senator Williams, and 5 other men involved in the conspiracy were arrested. The trial was held in Augusta in September 1857. It became one of the most publicized cases in Georgia's history, a rare instance where wealthy white men were actually prosecuted for crimes against black people. The evidence was overwhelming. The ledger, Ruth's testimony, statements from several victims who were tracked down and freed, and eventually confessions from several minor participants who testified in exchange for reduced sentences. Robert Montgomery Garrett was found guilty of kidnapping, human trafficking, and accessory to murder. He was sentenced to life in prison and died there in 1864. Senator James Williams committed suicide before trial. The other conspirators received sentences ranging from 10 to 25 years. As for Samuel and Ruth, after the trial, Judge Cartwright used his authority to have them emancipated. Ruth moved to Philadelphia, where she worked with abolitionist organizations, helping freed people establish new lives. She married in 1859 and lived to be 73 years old. Samuel remained in Georgia, working as a free carpenter in Augusta. He never returned to Riverside Manor, though he testified about the acoustic system in the house during the trial, explaining how he had overheard the conversations that led to the conspiracy's exposure. The house itself was sold to pay Garrett's debts and legal fees. Its new owners, unaware of the listening passages in the walls, lived there quietly until the house burned down in 1871. The cause of the fire was never determined. Inspector David Morrison, who received Williams' package with the ledger and Samuel's letter, did restart his investigation. Though the case was already being prosecuted in Georgia by the time he arrived, his work led to the exposure of similar operations in 3 other states, resulting in dozens more arrests. Over 40 people who had been kidnapped and sold into slavery were identified through Garrett's ledger and eventually freed. Many more were never found, their new identities and locations lost when co-conspirators destroyed their own records. The story of the slave who heard conversations inside walls became a legend in abolitionist circles, a reminder that even in places designed for silence and secrecy, truth has a way of being heard. The house's acoustic system, built to enable conspiracy, had instead become the instrument of its destruction. Sometimes the walls themselves confess. And sometimes, when you listen carefully enough in the quiet spaces, you can still hear the whisper of voices that refuse to be silenced, speaking truth into darkness, crying out for justice, insisting on being remembered.